The train whistle screamed through the morning fog like a warning. Ran Calter tightened his grip on the old canvas bag slung over his shoulder and took one last look down the weathered platform, already imagining the blur of distance that would erase this town behind him. He didn't plan on coming back, not to this place or any other. That was how he survived. Keep moving. Don't look back. Don't carry names. Don't answer to anyone. He stepped forward, boot tapping wood, and that was when he heard the voice. Sir, would you marry my mama? It was soft, trembling, too young to be real. Ran froze, then slowly turned. At first, he expected to find some drunkard making a joke or a group of teenagers playing tricks. Instead, he saw a boy, 6, maybe 7, standing alone. He wore a shirt too big for his frame, a wide-brimmed hat slipping over his ears, and clutched a single wildflower in his hand like it was all he had to offer. Ran blinked, certain he'd misheard. What? The boy stepped forward, chin lifted with a kind of brave desperation. Just for today, please. My mama, she's blind. She thinks today's the day Papa comes home. Ran glanced down the platform, where a young woman sat on a bench, her back straight, her eyes unfocused, a white cane propped beside her like a second spine. Her dress was clean, though faded from years of wear. She looked like someone who waited often, someone who didn't complain, someone who knew what it meant to hope for too long. Why me? Ran asked before he could stop himself. The boy shrugged. You looked kind, and you stopped walking. That answer hit harder than it should have. Kind? Ran wanted to laugh. He wasn't kind. He was a man running from something he'd done, something with blood and a badge and a brother he'd buried without digging a grave. He didn't belong in anyone's story, least of all a blind woman's dream. But then again, maybe that's why the lie tasted so tempting. He followed the boy's gaze, heart thudding like distant hoofbeats. She was beautiful, but not in the way that made men stare. There was something about her stillness, the way she held herself like a question waiting for the world to answer gently, that pulled at something inside him he thought long gone. I'm Micah, the boy said, his voice shaking now, and Mama's name is Hattie. She thinks Papa came back today. She don't know he's not coming. Ran inhaled sharply. The lie was already waiting for him, warm and ready to wear. He could say no. He could get on the train, keep running, leave this broken piece of someone else's life behind. But he didn't. Instead, he knelt beside the boy, brushed dust from his shirt collar, and whispered, all right, just for today. Mika's face didn't light up the way children's faces normally do. Instead, it softened, as if the weight on his tiny shoulders had shifted only slightly, but enough. Together, they walked toward the woman. Each step felt heavier, like trudging through past sins. Ran didn't know what to say, didn't know what name he'd answer to. He only knew that the moment her head tilted toward his footsteps and she smiled, a soft, knowing smile, he felt seen in a way he hadn't in years. Is that you? She asked, barely above a whisper. Ran hesitated. Then, with a breath that carried both guilt and surrender, he said, yeah, darling. It's me. She reached out, her hand brushing his coat like she was trying to trace memory through cloth. Your coat's different. Ran froze. Micah jumped in. It got torn last week. Remember? Papa had to get a new one. Hattie laughed, light and lovely like wind through dry grass. That's right. I always forget what day it is. She didn't question it any further. And that, more than her blindness, more than Mika's quiet pleading, was what undid him. The trust, unchecked, unearned, but given completely. They walked together slowly, her cane tapping, her hand grazing his sleeve now and then. When they reached the edge of the platform, she gestured to a cart. Home's not far. You hungry? Ran hesitated. Always. She laughed again. I made stew. You always loved my stew. That broke him more than any accusation ever had. Her voice didn't carry suspicion. It carried history. History that wasn't his but was being handed to him like a gift. Or maybe a test. Later, As the cart wheels bumped down the road, Micah leaned against his arm. Small, silent, but not afraid, Hattie hummed an old lullaby. One Rand recognized even though he'd never heard her voice before. It wasn't a song, it was safety, wrapped in melody. He told himself he'd leave after supper, that he'd stay long enough to be kind. But when Hattie handed him a blanket and asked if he was tired from the ride, he nodded. When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. And when she said, "You smell like pine. Did you come through the mountains again?" he answered with a lie that felt more like a promise. "I took the long way," he said softly. That night, sitting alone on the porch with the sheriff's badge in one hand and the knife in the other, he told himself this wasn't his life, that these people weren't his. But their names already felt like prayers in his mouth. And when Micah came out hours later, barefoot and brave, and asked, "You're not going to leave, are you?" Rand didn't have the strength to lie again. Because by then, the lie wasn't just for Hattie's peace anymore. It had become his, too. It was supposed to be a brief stop, just one night under the trees to rest before disappearing again. The wind had turned cold, and Rand Calter had wandered far off any trail, letting the river guide his steps like it always had, quiet, relentless, winding through places even maps forgot. He didn't plan to stay. He never did. But the cry shattered everything. It wasn't an animal, wasn't the low wail of wind between cottonwoods or a hawk overhead. It was sharp, human, terrified, a baby's cry. Rand's boots thudded against mud as he bolted toward the sound, his heart pounding with something far older than panic. It was instinct, deep and ancient, and it pushed him forward through tangled branches until he reached the riverbank. And there it was, a cradle, wooden, carved but worn, wedged against the rocks in the shallow water like it had floated in from some other world. Inside, wrapped in a thin, damp blanket, was a baby, no older than a few weeks, face red from crying, hands flailing, still alive. Rand didn't breathe. He dropped to his knees, boots soaking in the icy current, and reached in with trembling hands. The wood creaked under his touch. As he lifted the baby out, the blanket unraveled slightly, and something heavy clattered onto the rocks. A badge, silver, scratched, and stained with something too dark to be just river water. And beside it, nestled under the baby's leg, a knife. Rand stared. He knew the weight of that kind of blade. Not something ceremonial. This one had been used. Worn leather handle, the initials CD faintly etched into the hilt. His gut clenched. No, it couldn't be. But his hands were already moving, picking up the badge, wiping away grime, and when he turned it over, the name engraved on the back stopped his heart. Sheriff Caleb Dunn. He fell back onto the stones, the baby wailing against his chest now, tiny fists pounding uselessly against his coat. Rand barely felt it. He was too busy trying to breathe, trying to understand how that name had found its way back to him through blood and river water. Caleb, his brother, the one who'd stayed behind when Rand had left home, the one who had worn their father's badge after his death, the one who had written once, "You don't get to run forever." Rand, the land always remembers. That was years ago. Rand had stopped answering, stopped believing in redemption. He'd told himself Caleb would be fine without him, that his brother didn't need a half-Comanche outlaw shadowing his reputation. But now, the badge was here, the knife was here, and this baby, this child, had Caleb's cheekbones. Rand rocked slightly, his breath catching on the cold air and colder truth. Whoever had put this baby in the river hadn't meant for her to be found. They'd tied a story to her body, sealed it with violence and metal and floated her down like a warning or a grave. But she'd survived. He looked down at her face again. Her cries were softer now, as if she could feel the warmth of his chest, hear the thump of a heart that wasn't ready for this kind of weight. Her eyes blinked open once, dark, round, searching. He saw Caleb's gaze in them, and maybe something more. Rand stood slowly, cradling the baby tighter, and glanced around. No footprints, no signs of who had left her. Just the river whispering secrets he didn't want to hear. He couldn't take her into town. Not with that badge, not with his face. They'd accuse him of theft, or worse. A Comanche man with a white man's child and a lawman's blade? They'd hang him before he opened his mouth. But he couldn't leave her either. His brother's child, his niece, or maybe, no, he couldn't let his mind go there yet. The implications twisted like barbed wire. Caleb had never said anything about a child, had never even mentioned a woman. And yet, this girl had been sent into the world with only two things: a weapon and a name. And now Ran was the only one who knew. He wrapped her carefully in his coat, shielding her from the wind, and turned back toward the woods. He would find shelter. He would wait until nightfall. He would figure out what the hell to do. But even as he walked, his legs shaking beneath him, one thought followed him like a shadow. Someone had tried to erase her, and that meant someone would come looking. That night, in the safety of a cave he'd used once before, Ran lit a small fire and laid the baby beside him on a bed of pine needles. She didn't cry anymore, just slept with one tiny hand curled near her face, breathing soft and slow like the river she'd escaped. Ran stared into the flames, the badge and the knife resting beside his bedroll. He remembered Caleb's voice, steady, stern, proud, and he remembered the last time he saw his brother, standing tall on the porch of their father's house, refusing to leave the county, refusing to abandon the law even as it failed men like them. "You can't run from blood," Caleb had said. Ran had laughed then, but tonight, the words felt like prophecy. Because blood had floated to him in a cradle, and he had caught it. Now he had to decide what to do with it. The cabin wasn't much, just timber and time, a few worn pieces of furniture, and a roof that creaked at night when the wind turned. But to Ran, it was the quietest place he'd known in years. Not because it lacked sound, but because it lacked judgment. The silence here wasn't the kind that accused, it was the kind that held. He didn't remember deciding to stay. At first, it was just a night, then another, then he was chopping wood in the mornings, fixing the warped step outside the porch, walking down to the creek to bring back water without being asked. No one said a word about it. Not Hattie, not Micah. It was as if they knew that speaking too soon might scare the choice away. Hattie never asked him where he came from, never asked why his hands bore the calluses of both labor and violence, or why his eyes sometimes lingered too long on the horizon like he was waiting for a ghost. She simply handed him a bowl of stew each night, thanked him softly for the chores, and smiled in that quiet way of hers, gentle, like a sunrise that didn't need to announce itself. And somehow, that was what undid him. Not affection, not need, but the way she made space for him without demanding answers. It made him want to earn her silence, to fill it with something steady and safe. Micah had already claimed him, not with words, but with the way he reached for Ran's hand in the market, or the way he leaned his head against Ran's shoulder during evening story time. He never called him Papa, never asked him to be someone he wasn't. But when Ran rose to put another log on the fire or sharpened the kitchen knife with calm, practiced hands, the boy would simply say, "I'll help," and that was enough. One morning, while mending a crack in the fence, Ran found himself humming, not a tune he recognized, just something that came from deep within. Hattie stepped outside, her cane tapping gently ahead of her, and paused on the porch. "You hum when you're not thinking," she said. Ran looked up, surprised. "Didn't know I was. I like it," she added, sitting on the top step. "It sounds like someone remembering who they are." He didn't respond, but the words stayed with him all day. That night, after Micah had fallen asleep in his small cot, Hattie sat by the fireplace with a blanket draped over her legs, her hands folding and unfolding the edge of the fabric. "She needs a name," she said softly. Ran turned from where he was adding wood to the stove. The baby, still so small, slept soundly in a makeshift cradle they'd carved from a repurposed apple crate. Her cheeks were round now, color returning to them. She grunted once in her sleep, hands twitching. I didn't want to name her until she was safe. Hattie continued, until I knew she was staying. Rand's heart skipped. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. She's staying, he said. She nodded. Then she deserves a name that carries her truth, not just where she came from, but where she belongs. They sat for a while, the firelight dancing between them. Rand looked at the child, then back to Hattie. I was thinking, Kaylin, he said at last. Hattie's head tilted. That's not English. No, he said, voice quieter. It's Comanche. Means, light in the storm. A small smile crept across her lips. Fitting. He watched her fingers reach forward slowly, tracing the edge of the cradle. And her last name? He hesitated. Stratton. She looked up. Your name? Rand nodded once. If it's all right. It is, she said, without pause. It's more than all right. Kaylin Stratton. The name hung in the room like a promise spoken aloud for the first time. They didn't need to say it out loud, that she wasn't theirs by blood. That she had arrived by river and fate, carried by something larger than coincidence. What mattered was that she was here now, breathing the same air, hearing the same lullabies, wrapped in the arms of people who chose her fiercely and without question. As the fire dwindled to soft coals, Hattie spoke again. She quiets when you hold her, she said. Rand glanced down at his arms where the child now lay, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of his shirt. She knows, Hattie said. You may not say much, but she knows. Rand swallowed. His chest ached with something he couldn't name, something between awe and ache, a longing he hadn't dared acknowledge. He looked across the room at Hattie. I'm not good with words, he said. I don't need words, she replied. I need someone who stays. Rand didn't promise, but he didn't look away either. Later that week, he sanded the edge of the cradle and carved her name carefully into the wood. Kaylin Stratton, his hand steady for once. Hattie sat nearby, stitching a small blanket from scraps she'd saved over the years, humming softly, and when she stood to place the finished blanket inside the cradle, her hand brushed his. Neither of them moved. In that moment, something passed between them, not passion, not even romance, just understanding, the kind of closeness that doesn't demand, that simply is. And in that quiet cabin, with a sleeping child and a boy who had found safety in shadows, a man who had no home began to feel what it meant to belong. Not because of blood, but because someone chose to keep him. The sun had barely crested the ridge when Hattie first saw the rider. She stood in the kitchen, rocking Kaylin gently in her arms, the scent of fresh oats rising from the stovetop. The window above the sink faced the pasture. It framed the open land like a painting. And today, it framed trouble. A rider was cutting across the far edge of the property, tall in the saddle, a brown coat dusted pale from the road. She couldn't see details, but she didn't need to. Something in her chest twisted, the kind of knowing that comes not from sight, but from the hush that follows bad news. She whispered a soft tune into Kaylin's ear to keep her calm and stepped outside. Rand was already waiting by the porch. He stood with his back straight, arms folded, his boots planted wide on the ground like roots refusing to be pulled. The axe he'd used to chop wood earlier leaned casually against the wall, close enough to reach, but untouched. He wasn't there to threaten. He was there to protect. The rider approached slowly, a lean man with eyes the color of ash, dressed in the faded coat of a deputy. He removed his hat as he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Rand Stratton? He asked. Rand didn't flinch. That's right. The deputy nodded. Name's Harrow. Been riding out from Lincoln, following a trail that ended at the river. Thought it might pick up again around here. What kind of trail? Rand asked, though he already knew. Harrow reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. It was a wanted poster, creased from too many miles and stained at the edges. He handed it over without ceremony. The sketch was familiar, sharply drawn, The eyes, even in charcoal, were unmistakable. Caleb Dunn, suspected of robbing a bank, Harrow said, vanished 2 months ago with something that didn't belong to him. Last seen with a baby. Rand's jaw tightened. I've seen no one by that name, he said evenly. Harrow tilted his head, listening to the distant cooing from inside the cabin. And the child? Rand met his gaze without blinking. My daughter. There it was, a lie spoken like truth. But it didn't tremble. The deputy narrowed his eyes. She don't look like you. She doesn't look like you either, Rand said. Harrow exhaled. Not angry, not hostile, just wary. Folks in town say a badge washed up not far from here. Along with a knife. I buried both. Hattie's voice rang out from the doorway. They turned. She stood holding Kaylin close. Her stance calm but firm, like stone softened by rain. Micah hovered behind her, clutching her skirt. I found the child, she continued. She was cold and crying. We took her in. That's the whole story. You didn't bring the badge to the sheriff? Harrow asked. It didn't belong to anyone anymore, she said. At least, no one who would come back for it. Harrow studied her face, then Rand's. His eyes were sharp, searching, but they found no cracks. She's ours, Rand said simply. The deputy stared a long moment, the wind tugging at the corner of his coat. Then he folded the poster, slowly, deliberately, and tucked it back into his bag. I've been writing too long to argue with a man who looks like he's already chosen his ground, he said, and just like that, he tipped his hat and turned away. They watched him ride back across the pasture, his horse kicking up dust that shimmered in the morning light. When he disappeared over the hill, Hattie's knees buckled slightly. Rand caught her with one arm, steadying her without a word. You lied for her, she whispered. No, Rand said softly. I told the truth. She is mine, and so are you. That night, the cabin held a different kind of silence. Not fear, not tension, but something deeper, something settled. Rand sat at the table, the knife and badge, now wrapped in cloth, resting quietly in a wooden box. The river had tried to bury them. The law had tried to reclaim them. But now, they belonged to no one but memory. Across from him, Hattie stitched a name into the corner of Kaylin's blanket. People in town are talking, she said without looking up. Let them, he replied. They say we're liars, that we're hiding something. We are, he said. We're hiding a child who was meant to be lost. And we're not sorry for it. She looked up then. You'd stand against all of them for us? Rand didn't hesitate. I already have. She nodded once. That was enough. The following Sunday, they walked into town, together. Rand held Kaylin against his chest. Hattie held Mika's hand. Whispers followed them down the street like wind in dry grass. But no one stepped forward. No one dared challenge what they saw. A man who stood like a stone wall. A woman who walked with unwavering grace. And 2 children wrapped in quiet love. At the church, the preacher paused. His eyes flicked between them and the open pews. Then he nodded silently, and the service began. They sat in the last row, hands joined, surrounded by suspicion, but untouched by it. From that day forward, no one questioned the family on the hill. The badge stayed buried, the truth stayed guarded, and the child who came from the river would grow up not with whispers, but with arms that had fought to keep her safe. Because family wasn't declared by law, it was defended. Spring came slowly to the valley, like a promise finally kept. The frost melted from the grass. The trees budded soft green along the hills, and birds returned with songs that filled the sky long before sunrise. On the porch of the little cabin, Hattie sat with Kaylin in her lap, brushing the child's hair with careful fingers, her face tilted toward the warm breeze. Inside, Rand was hammering the final plank into place on the second room he'd added to the cabin. He worked without hurry, humming under his breath, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The rhythm of the hammer like a heartbeat settling into a new rhythm of life. Their home had grown, not with riches or reward, but with time, love, and small acts of care. A thicker roof, a stronger fence, a garden now thriving behind the cabin, full of carrots, herbs, and sunflowers that Micah swore were growing just to listen to Hattie's stories. They were not a conventional family. No paper trail or bloodlines could name them so. But it didn't matter. The truth of who they were existed in the spaces between things. In the way Kaylin giggled when Rand tossed her gently into the air. In the way Micah leaned against Hattie's shoulder during quiet evenings. In the laughter that echoed between the trees. One evening, after the dishes had been washed and the lanterns lit, Hattie sat by the hearth with a journal in her lap. She had begun to write again. In the quiet hours after Kaylin had been tucked in and Rand had fallen asleep with Micah curled at his side. She wrote slowly, with her fingers tracing the edges of each page, imagining how the story would sound when read aloud to the child someday. Not a tale of sorrow or loss, but one of choice and love. In her soft, looping script, she wrote, "You were not born into our family by name or blood, Callan, but you were born into it by love. We did not inherit you, we chose you. And you, without even knowing it, chose us right back." Rand entered quietly and sat beside her, brushing sawdust from his hands. He glanced at the journal, then at her. "What are you writing tonight?" he asked. "Our story," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Thought we were still living it." "We are," she said with a smile. "But I want her to know where it began. I want her to understand that what makes a family isn't the same blood in your veins. It's the hand that stays when it could have let go. It's the voice that says, 'You're mine,' and means it." Rand reached over and gently closed the journal, setting it aside. Then he pulled her close until her head rested on his shoulder. And for a long while they just listened to the crackling fire and the soft breath of their sleeping children. "She already knows," he whispered. And maybe she did. Kaylin had started taking her first steps that week, wobbling proudly across the floor between Rand's arms and Hattie's voice. Her giggles like wind chimes in the spring air. Her first word had not been mama or papa, it had been home. They weren't sure if she even knew what it meant, but it felt right. Micah, older now and full of questions, had asked once where Kaylin came from. Hattie had told him the truth. Not the whole truth, but the part that mattered. "She came to us from the river," she said, "but she stayed because we opened the door." He had nodded, satisfied with that. Children, she had learned, understood far more than they were given credit for. At the back of the property, Rand had built a small wooden box with a latch. Inside it lay the old badge and the knife. They were no longer secrets, but relics, reminders. He would show them to Kaylin one day, when she was old enough to ask, but not before she knew, without question, that who she was had nothing to do with how she started. The town, once wary and sharp, had softened too. People still whispered, but fewer did it with malice. Most just nodded now when Rand passed by with Kaylin on his hip or when Hattie brought stew to the sick neighbor up the hill. Time, it seemed, had worked its slow forgiveness. One morning, as the garden bloomed and the sky blushed pink with early light, Hattie walked barefoot into the yard and knelt in the soft dirt. She carried Kaylin in her arms, and with her free hand, she traced a name into the earth. Callan Dunn Stratton. Rand stepped out of the cabin and saw her kneeling there. He moved toward her, quiet as ever, and asked gently, "Why both names?" "Because she should know where she came from," Hattie replied, "but also where she belongs." Rand nodded, then crouched beside her. He pressed his palm into the soil below the name, leaving his mark beside hers. It felt like a seal, like truth made visible. That night, they sat on the porch, the stars blooming above them like tiny lanterns. Rand held Kaylin in his arms while Hattie leaned into his side. Her fingers twined with his. "You ever think you'd end up here?" she asked softly. Rand looked out over the land, the moonlight spilling across the fields. "No," he said, "but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." She smiled, her voice full of something deep and sure. "Neither can I." Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, The walls bore no framed pictures, but they held stories in their grain. And on the small shelf by the door sat a journal, waiting for Kaylin to one day read it. A record not of where she came from, but of the love that claimed her, kept her, and never let go. Because in that quiet corner of the world, under stars and by choice, they had built something sacred. A family, not born, but chosen. And that, Hattie knew, was more than enough.